Last time, we explored some of the mathematics that underpins music, why that matters and doesn't matter, and why humans are so enamoured with music in the first place. In this episode, we're going to look at how people first began making music and how it began to spread across the globe, even before we knew that the planet was, in fact, a globe, which it is, of course. And if you disagree with that, I actually don't know how your YouTube algorithm led you here, but you are now in the right place. Welcome. I'm Charlotte Ritchie, and this is, for the record, an incomplete history of music. We can't know for certain how long humans have been making music because, well, melodies don't leave fossils. The reality is that there is even a great debate over when and how language itself evolved in early humans, with linguists arguing for everything from 200,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. One thing most scientists do agree on, though, is that musicality probably predated language. So let's begin this episode by asking that classic burning question I know that you are all wondering. Did Neanderthals hum?
If we think about the evolution of language didn't just suddenly appear. It evolved very gradually in different phases. And there's no doubt that Neanderthals had some aspects of language. The Neanderthals are a type of human, a member of our genus, Homo. They evolved from an ancestor that had originally migrated out of Africa, probably appearing at around 600,000 or 500,000 years ago. That's around 150,000 years ago, and then more so after 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, our species, spread out of Africa. And in some cases, we interbred with the Neanderthals. So that means all of us carry, or majority of us carry, a few Neanderthal genes. But the Neanderthals went extinct, and Homo sapiens survived, and we're the only species on the planet now. I think we can be confident that Neanderthals had musicality simply because we can look at our living relatives today, such as chimpanzees or gorillas or other great apes and even monkeys, with whom we shared ancestors millions of years ago. They all have musicality. And in any case, Neanderthals had a wonderful musical instrument. They had their body. They had vocal tracts. They had muscularity, so they could move their arms, so they could gesture in rhythms and so forth. So there's inherent musicality to any particularly bipedal human walking two legs, because you have all your upper body and your arms that you can swing and sway and dance and gesticulate, often in a rhythmic manner. I think we have two lines of evidence. Now, they're both problematic. Okay, one is the simple fact that we know the Neanderthals survived in these very challenging environments. We know they lived in quite complex societies. They collaborated with each other. They cooperated with each other for big game hunting, for making tools. They passed on their traditions of tool making from one generation to another. Now, they must have had sophisticated communication systems to be able to do that. And if we think they haven't got sophisticated modern language like we've got, what were they using? Let me give you one really good example. We know at times Neanderthals were hunting big game. They were hunting bison and horse. That's a dangerous thing to do. All they had was wooden spears. They've had to be working as a group. And what's the most important thing for that? You've got to trust. Now, how do you build up trust between groups? How do we do it today? Well, normally we sing and dance together, That singing and dancing together is all about building up trust, removing your individuality to become a member of a group. I cannot imagine Neanderthals would be able to do their collaborative, cooperative activities unless they had a lot of trust between individuals. And the only means we know that could have been generated was through their musicality, through singing and dancing. But then we also have their skeletal remains. We know they had a vocal tract, much the same as ours. There's slight differences, but much the same. We know they could have made a wide range of different sounds. So we know they had the capability for musicality, and we know they had the need for musicality. So I think you put them together, it's difficult to conclude that they didn't have this musicality and they weren't using it day to day in their lives. Now, whether Neanderthals are also using it for pure entertainment is conjecture. I think they probably were, but to a rather limited extent compared to what we do today. You see, I think what happened is once Homo sapiens evolved fully modern language, language took over many of these other functions. Rather than having to sing to you to show that I like you or I love you and so forth, I could just say, I love you, all right?
There are things called human universals that we see them in loads of different cultures, and we see them throughout history. Like language is a human universal. Music is a human universal. And music, in a way, is even more so than language because it can travel across cultures, and through history, music can be understood. The very first sort of music can still be listened to and elicit an emotional response now. Music from completely different cultures can still be listened to and elicit a emotional response from people the other side of the world with completely different lives. So I think there is something to be said for kind of the power of music to be more than talking or more than other kinds of sounds because of that emotional resonance that it has.
Won't you give me love, give me love, give me peace on earth, give me light, give me life.
It's almost certain that music of some description, be it purely functional or potentially artistic in nature as well, was a part of Neanderthal life. But we wanted to come face to face with the first concrete evidence of deliberate music creation by humans. So we took off to find the oldest known surviving musical instrument in the world. An instrument that proves conclusively that tens of thousands of years ago, the hills were indeed alive with the sound of music. Specifically, the hills of southern Germany.
We can prove for a fact that about 40,000 years ago, people start systematically producing musical instruments in large numbers because we have the objects. We can hold them in our hands, we can see how they're made, and we know how they're played and what kind of music you can play with them. Well, we're in Hohlefels Cave in southwestern Germany in the state of Baden-Württemberg near the village of Schäklingen. And Hohlefels is extremely important because we have remnants left here by Neanderthals and later by early modern humans in the upper and the middle Paleolithic. That's what I really focus on with most of my work. We have definite evidence for flutes made from vulture bones, griffin vulture radii, the wing bones, swan wing bones, and flutes carved from mammoth ivory, which is a lot more work than making a flute from a hollow bone. The question is which is the oldest, the strongest arguments are for the vulture flute. I think the more salient point is that in all of these layers of the Aurignacian period, this first period of modern humans in our area between about 35,000 and 42,000, we find clear evidence of music. Okay, so if you look at it, there are a number of things. There are 5 holes. Here you can see these same beveled holes. They're not drilled at all. They always have the sharp edge. This one's broken. It's very typical that the flutes break on the holes, but you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes and a forked end. You can actually blow into either end and play depending on how you want to play. It's also possible to play with a reed. This is a replica, of course, but if you tap on it, you can get a sort of rhythm out of it as well. And I remember when we found it in 2008 and prepared the publication, I needed to get music from the flute because that's the first question everyone always asks. Well, what does it sound like? And it was right after Barack Obama had been elected, and the first piece ever played on the flute was American Star Spangled Banner because the first 3 natural tones are da da da. You can any kind of melody you can play on this flute. And the point is you can get a whole range of different notes. I often get the question, well, is it on the same scale that we might know from a piano? And the answer is yes, you can play many of those notes on this flute. And you can also play other kinds of notes. So you can play on a pentatonic scale, but also other scales. It's a very flexible instrument. And you can also play voiced with reeds.
These flutes from 40,000 years ago are the oldest direct evidence of humans making some sort of organised music. Any instruments made by earlier humans, such as neanderthals, are likely lost to time due to them being made by materials like wood. However, we should say that there are claims of a flute made from a cave bear bone dating back to the time of Neanderthals. But when we began to look into it, we found ourselves in a good old-fashioned scientific debate.
There is this so-called Neanderthal flute from Slovenia.
Divyabava you may have heard about.
It looks, superficially, it looks a bit like a flute.
The scientific community rejects those claims because the scientists argue that the holes reflect natural damage. There are a whole range of reasons why.
It's most likely a chewed bone with the holes coming from carnivore teeth and so forth, which coincidentally looks like a flute. So I don't think that is a Neanderthal instrument.
Some have hypothesized that, for instance, certain flutes, Neanderthalian periods, with holes in them, would have meant that they knew where to drill these holes. I completely disagree with this, especially that now we know that a lot of bones with holes in them, the holes were the result of animals gnawing the holes to eat the marrow, and they were not designed to be flutes. And they would not have been able to calculate hole dimensions. It's very complicated for flutes because to the size of the holes, the placement of the holes, and the dimension of the bore inside the flute makes it a complex mathematical operation.
I don't think that means they didn't make some simple instruments, though. I mean, you know, chimpanzees, they bang on trees and so forth. Neanderthals were surely using drums, whether they were entirely natural objects or whether they were partially made.
Now we are now getting to the middle of the bridge where we are, So the main reason why I just say it is right now we start with the voice and hand is because before instruments come in, before we get the idea of building an instrument, those used to be the thing we do. Hands banging on anything near you to create a rhythm. So this is how the idea build up, and then we get somewhere. We just create music out of what is near us. It can be talking, feet, any noise around you can turn to music, and you can dance through that.
We know that they were making fibres or twining fibres together. So they could have been making bull roarers. I'm surely they were banging sticks together and even just making flintstone tools. That makes a musical sound when you hit the rocks.
A fair question anyone might have at this point is, how can we be sure which flutes were definitely made by humans and which just have holes caused by a hungry carnivore?
I'm holding a flute made from the radius of a swan. It's definitely made from human hands, right? The end of the flute is cut. Here it's unfortunately broken, but also these marks, they're very distinctive. You can see them. They're made by people. Also the beveled holes are definitely carefully carved out rather than drilled. And when you have a wind column an air column going through the flute, the idea is that having that sharp edge rather than a dull edge from drilling straight through cuts the air column better and gives you a better sound.
There's something fundamentally different about those Homo sapiens after 70,000 years ago. That's got to be fully modern language. And no doubt they're also making huge amount of music and musicality, because it's within those that we see the first musical instruments being made, such as the beautiful bone flutes coming from Upper Paleolithic in Germany. They're quite complex to make, and I suspect they needed language to be able to develop and transmit the technical skills to make those very fine artefacts.
One of the things that struck the Shambles crew most when they were stood in that cave was the incredible sense of place. We'll come back to that idea as it relates to music in a later episode, but for now I think it's worth thinking about music in that very cave. The acoustics were impeccable, and it's not a leap to think that families may have chosen this particular cave not just for shelter or access to nearby food, but because it sounded nice. It was a good place to play, and maybe that's not something you tend to think about, but hunter-gatherer societies, particularly in the deep winter months in somewhere like Germany, had a lot of free time. And so how do you fill that time? You tell stories, you sing songs, and you make art. When our director, Trent, suggested to Nicholas that this very cave would have been filled with young early humans all trying to learn the vulture flute, there was something incredibly wonderfully human knowing that 40,000 years ago, an early human parent looked at their child learning the recorder of the time and said, "Give it a rest for 5 fucking minutes, please, my head is killing me." Nicholas then said that in all his years of taking people to that cave and in his many years of academic conferences, no one had ever made that specific observation before.
Yeah, Trent, I agree with you completely that the more you engage with the material culture and touch and feel and look at the pieces, I agree completely that that gives us a very direct link to the people who lived here and gives us insight to them. We don't have all the answers, but I think we have a lot of answers, and we're able to address questions that without the flutes would be much harder to formulate. Well, what did the music sound like? When was the music played? And so if you find a lot of flutes and fragments of flutes just in the garbage, that tells you they must have been a pretty important part of daily life, right? And the same applies for the artworks. They're also just there right where people lived. But I would say as a human being familiar with music, it's certainly possible to have ideas or feelings about what life would have been like and how you would take a vulture bone and make a flute out of it, how you'd feel. And if you were a musician, which I am not, and you were good at playing music, you'd know how people respond to music. And all of these different things must have been part of life 40,000 years ago, right here where we're standing.
For these examples of caves and churches, you want that kind of envelopment of sound, which is why I think we are naturally tuned to that. I think as music evolved, particularly our sense of spaciousness also evolved along with it. I think it also depends on the context, because a lot of these places maybe were particularly used for worship or for chanting. And with that kind of sound, you want something that is very reverberant, that's surrounding you, very immersive.
As human society continued to evolve, we know that music must have played an important role in ancient civilizations, thanks to archaeological finds in places such as China and Mesopotamia. Bone flutes dating back to 6000 BCE and before have been unearthed in Neolithic tombs in central China. And the standard of a 3rd millennium BCE artifact of the Sumerians, depicts musicians alongside warriors and royalty. It's thought that these early musical depictions on standards, a sort of panel depicting someone's allegiance, were a direct early predecessor to all those annoying flags at Glastonbury. Things we associate with ancient Egyptian culture and iconography. Pharaohs, pyramids, cats, and run-down Las Vegas casinos. But unless we're thinking of the bangles, perhaps we don't associate it with music as much as we should.
So music was actually an integral component of creation itself. So in some of the creation myths, we see the goddess Merit, who was the goddess of chanting and music, and she's there with Atum, who is the creator god, and she basically, she's portrayed with these gestures which are akin to musical composition. So through her musical composition, she actually creates cosmic order itself. So is intrinsically entwined with creation itself. So basically, to invoke the gods, you would play beautiful music, you would sing to them, you would chant, you would recite hymns. So we have these priests in temples with these musical processions. And there's one interesting image of Hathor where in the Temple of Dendera, so the priests, there's a route that they would take for the procession, and they would go up these steps, and adjacent to these steps is actually a hymn to Hathor herself. And the hymn says, the stars and the sky play music to you, the sun and the moon praise you, the gods exalt you, the goddesses sing to you. So the priests would be playing the sistrum, which is like a rattle, and it would be adorned with images of Hathor. And they would go up these steps, and when they reached the top, they would reach the roof, and there was another little temple dedicated to Hathor. So Hathor became a household favorite goddess. A lot of the gods had dual roles, so she would be also a destructive goddess as well in some forms. But so to appease her, you would play music, you would sing to her, you would chant, because you wanted her the good side of Hathor. The great thing about Egyptian history is that we do have a plethora of musical instruments that have actually survived, particularly the percussion instruments. We see quite early on, because the earliest percussion instruments would have been clappers. It would have been, first of all, people clapping their hands, and then the Egyptians actually made ivory clappers in the shape of hands. And one of the other earliest instruments we start seeing is the harp in the Old Kingdom period.
The Egyptians continued to innovate with musical instruments through the New Kingdom period, which ended around 1070 BCE. They made more sophisticated harps along with instruments such as clarinets, trumpets and oboes, because as well as being important in pleasing the gods, music was also a fundamental part of day-to-day life in ancient Egypt.
Music was just everywhere in ancient Egypt. It was an integral component of their everyday life. I have to say the ancient Egyptians loved to party, so any excuse to party. This is a side of them we don't hear that much about, but they've depicted it all over their tombs. We see the fact, so they had quite a few festivals, and there's one particular festival which I really think is fantastic. It's called the Festival of Drunkenness. And this was where they would play a lot of music. Basically, the party goers would go there, and it was to have this communion with the goddess Hathor, the goddess of music. So they would go there and they would literally listen to music all day and drink until they dropped. And then once they'd all sort of fallen asleep in their drunken state, they would be woken up by the sounds of drums. And the thought was, while they're still drunk, feeling a little bit drowsy, they would have this fantastic encounter with the goddess herself, and they could ask the god for whatever they wanted.
So it would seem that as long as there has been music, there's been a bar. Now, across the Mediterranean Sea, music also played a major role in the times of the ancient Greeks.
It was extraordinarily prevalent. It was ubiquitous in many ways. It was a very musical culture. So it was in ceremonies, in theatre, in symposia, which were groups of generally elite men who would sing songs in parties. It was accompanying work. There is a strong sense that musical sound is something more than just noise. It's something that has a strong effect on the human mind, even on the human body, also even on nature. So some of the early myths, such as Orpheus, Orpheus was the lyre player whose playing enchanted the animals and the trees. There is something about that in all Greek writings about music. It's not just a technical matter, it's something quite magical. One of the earliest words for the effect of music is indeed that, enchantment, ephelxis in Greek. You respond to it with delight of some kind.
Ancient Greece is often referred to as one of the key cradles of modern Western culture that influenced everything from political structures to scientific schools of thought. But how much of the music of 2,000 plus years ago can we find in the Western music of today?
Musicologists would have told you that there is no influence at all from Greek music to modern Western music. So when I was studying music in the 1970s, essentially Western music, we were told, began with Gregorian plainsong, which is 9th or 10th century AD. This is when it starts to happen. Having said that, what is fascinating about the research that has been done on ancient Greek music is that it shows a sensibility which is clearly akin to that of the sensibility of modern Western music. So if you go back to the earliest piece of music reconstructed from the 5th century BC, that of the scrap of Euripides' Orestes. We find a couple of things. One is that when the music talks about going up, so when the words talk about jumping up and so on, the music jumps up. Da-dum. So if you jump up, you're jumping up in pitch. Now that might seem like an obvious intuition to us. You know, we don't say jump down, you say jump up. But it's not so obvious, and it is not the case in lots of musical traditions. It is the case in Greek music, and it is the case in modern Western music.
Go jump for joy. Yeah, man. Happy as a baby boy. My baby bought me a brand new...
We know that the Roman world adopted Greek music. They adopted Greek meter, they adopted Greek melodies. The only Roman musicians we know about whose music we still have are Greeks who were at the court of the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD. So Mesomedes was his favourite freedman. He was from Crete. And we have some of the songs written by Mesomedes with notation. So the Romans were listening to music that they would have considered to be Greek music. Their own musical traditions, no doubt, would have been influenced, as the way their metrical traditions were almost entirely influenced by Greek meters.
Much of the ancient music we've covered so far is taking steps towards a sort of formalisation with the beginnings of notation and even ticketed performances. But before we dig into that, let's cross over to the other side of the world to explore one of the oldest musical traditions we know of, and one of the oldest living populations in the world, with some researchers indicating it may stretch back well beyond 65,000 years. We are, of course, talking about the First Nations people of Australia.
Some of the traditions that were handed down, it's guesstimated to be tens of thousands of years old. So the moment you're hitting two sticks together, that can take you back to thousands of years. The boomerang itself has been around for tens of thousands of years, so that hitting of that together has been a long time. And because the didgeridoo is not from our country, I don't know how old it is, but I know it's been around quite a few hundred, if not thousands years before contact.
So it's important to note some context here. When Richard says the didgeridoo is not from his country, he's not referring to the country of Australia. The First Nation people use the word country to refer to different aspects of the land, its history and culture throughout their traditional lands. So Richard comes from Noongar country, an area of southwestern Australia, whereas the didgeridoo hails from Yolngu country in the northeast of Arnhem Land. And contact, well, that refers to the first time that white explorers, or rather invaders to be more accurate, arrived on their shores in the 17th century.
With our identity and belonging,
we have this obligation to learn, and we have an obligation to maintain and pass it on. So I'm doing the same with my children and grandchildren today, what my grandparents did with me and my parents. So we had this strong connect, and we handed that down. So with my father's brother and me a song, he'd sing the Bilya Kulling song. That was handed down to him because he was what called a bilya duck. He was looking after the river. Another one of my uncles was a fellow that looked after a lot of the hills and the bushland. So he'd have the songs from there. So collectively, you'd have different songs. So I'd get some songs. All my other cousins and brother cousins would all get the songs. So in the family, you'd keep these songs. So it's not one person becomes the authority or the encyclopedia of it. We're collectively linked together, and that still applies today. So when I do some traditional songs, I'd sing some things like Jiningenbo, Jiningenbo, Ngala Boja, Jiningenbo, Nyunga Boja, Jiningenbo. What that means is I'm looking at a distance at our country, Nyunga country. Then I can have the verses come in of where a kangaroo goes past. Jiningenbo, Jiningenbo, Yonga Koring, Jiningenbo, Yonga Koring, Jiningenbo. I can sing about the kangaroo, because that's in the song now. Or another day it'll be an emu going past. Jiningenbo, Jiningenbo, wait ya Koring, Jiningenbo, wait ya Koring, Jiningenbo. So that adapts it. So the Jiningenbo and the foundation of Nyunga country will never change. But the storyline of what you're seeing, whether it's an emu or a kangaroo or an eagle or something that goes past the possums, you include them into the song, so that becomes the past and the present linked into this contemporary traditional fashion of respect for a song.
Many indigenous musical traditions around the world are oral instead of written, passed down through the generations. Another example comes from the Inuit people of North America, who practice a unique type of throat singing known as katajak, that's been handed down amongst the women in families for millennia.
We learn mostly from aunties and cousins. We have one cousin, Ivik Ayalik from Kogloktok Nunavut. She's an expert. She always bested us in every game, and she's who we learned a lot of our songs from. So Inuit-style throat singing is typically done between two women, although it's not taboo for folks of any gender to throat sing. And so it's a game, it's a song form, it's a game, it's a way of putting your babies to sleep, it's a way to bond with one another, and you're basically trying to outpace the other person. So if they lose the beat, you would win, or if you were to laugh, your partner would win, and if you're super hardcore, no smiling, which is tough when you're sisters. You know, we would play while we were out on the land hunting. You know, we'd be out for sometimes weeks at a time, and every single battery in the Walkman was dead, and every coloring book had been completely filled, and the weather was, you know, keeping you inside the tent. So we passed the time with throat singing. And
along with like many other covers of like Alanis Morissette and Ace of Base.
But like with throat singing.
Enya.
We were exposed to Enya and Tim Burton a little early, so.
Definitely formative.
Definitely formative, yes.
Aesthetic of PIQSIQ. And so the songs themselves are taken inspiration from the oral world around us, like anything that's making sound, whether it's the weather, chores, you know, different animals, different land formations, rivers, anything that makes sounds. And, you know, we're not doing a one-for-one mimicry of those sounds. We're doing a creative interpretation of what those sounds are and turning them into a song form. And like Inukshuk said, it's you know, it is a game, it is all those things, but it's also a really nice way to bond with your singing partner and to, you know, kind of just get lost in the melody. And
because you're so locked in, like we stand face to face in the traditional form and hold on to each other so that you can anticipate every little thing that your partner's going to do. So you're very locked in when you're throat singing.
Indigenous people pass their songs down from person to person, and Egyptians have left us with a treasure trove of instruments, beer recipes, and depictions of their musical lives. The Greeks, however, not unlike a passive-aggressive flatmate, left lots of notes.
You have some records from ancient Greece. There was clearly a lot of theoretical thinking around music there. We've got these Greek thinkers who think about it, and there's a few existing sources. The question is not really when they did start writing, it's like what survives, because we don't have very many sources surviving, but the odd bits of like tablets do show us that there was an early urge to record some elements of music. But we do have records from sort of 1300 BC, where you have sort of Syrian records of people recording notation, recording music in some form.
It was written about 1400 in the city of Ugarit, which is on north west coast of Syria. It was written in the Hurrian language, a language which was totally unknown at the time of the discovery of the tablets in the 1950s. And what was interesting about this is that they were written with the Babylonian script. Luckily, I was able to make sense of one part of the tablet because it had names of intervals which were written in Hurrianized Babylonian. So Kablite in Hurrian was Kablitum in Babylonian. So it was not difficult to find that they were the same thing. That was an example, you know, and finally we managed to discover what vaguely the text was about. And it was a song. It was the story of a young woman who cannot have any children, and she believes that she is sterile because she has been a bad girl and had a go at it before marriage. And so therefore she goes at night to pray the goddess Nikal, the goddess of the moon, offering her sacrifice of sesame oil perhaps, or seeds, and begging her to become pregnant. That was the song. The composition has an introduction. It has a corpus and then a conclusion, and the conclusion automatically leads back to the introduction for a second playing of the whole lot. So it is structured, and furthermore, each line has 36 beats. So it is, the metrics are regular, 36, repeated at the beginning of 72, and 36, 36, 36, 36, and 36. So there's a structure there. Well, it's extraordinary. It's absolutely magical. You know, and when you arrive with a melody which wouldn't seem strange today, that's the most remarkable thing. It's totally audible to our modern ears.
Of course, keeping a physical record of music these days is commonplace. We'll get onto the recording of music in a later episode, but for now, let's keep the focus on notation. The sort of notation you'll find in a standard sheet music book is the kind that most people will be familiar with today, and clearly it bears almost no resemblance to the tablets from Syria.
The music we read is based on something called a stave, which has 5 long lines going across and 4 space notes in between. So we will introduce something called a bass clef, which is when you're reading purely for the left hand, and then a treble clef, which is when you're reading purely for the right hand.
A clef is a piece of music notation that helps musicians to understand where their notes are on the page.
Now, it's a little bit confusing because the method to reading in the right hand is completely different to the left hand.
We could, of course, spend multiple episodes just on how to read music, but we've already got enough ground to cover on how we devised the system in the first place. Last episode, we touched on how Pythagorean and equal temperament tuning had influenced much of Western music that followed. But can the same be said for its early forays into notation?
They didn't use a notation, of course. They used these things called neumes, where, you know, lines which went up and down.
there's various ideas of where neumes came from, but a lot of people have suggested it kind of recreates the gestures that someone would show you on how to sing. So there's a lot of lines up and dots and lines down. It is like memory jogging, or it, often it's inserted between the lines of text. So when you read that text and you try and remember how you were singing that chant, you have a sort of melodic line following. So it's almost like a child would make a notation if they don't know how to do notation. It's kind of intuitive, I find. You can go, it goes up and down, so it has this melodic line. So it's not necessarily bullet pointing in that sense, but it is jogging your memory. It is an aide-memoire.
So even that wasn't part of the tradition that you mentioned. You talk about notation, CDE in modern notation, and the letters of the alphabet in Greek notation. There was no direct transmission. By that stage, the knowledge of the Greek notation system seems to have been lost. They didn't therefore use notes as the Greeks did. They used alpha, beta, gamma as the way we might use CDE, slightly differently because they did it going down, whereas you go da, da, da for CDE. But that didn't survive. So you can't say that that's part of the continuous tradition. And as I say, musically, it was assumed that actually the ancient Greek world had no connection with Gregorian plainsong, which was seen as the basis of Western music as it then continued to develop.
There's certain types of music that lend themselves to being written out, and more complex polyphony is one of those. And by writing it down, it sort of helps pass on music between generation and between countries. Has various reasons to do that. That's the preservation of a certain repertoire. It also helps education. You can help people, show them how to read music. You can sort of pass it on between different schools. You can standardize it to some extent. So it has an element of being able to standardize. This is where it became a topic in the Catholic Church, when they were trying to standardize how a certain liturgical formula would be sung. You can of course pass this on orally, but if you write it down, it is a little bit more fixed. So it has this idea of sort of being fixed on a page and allowing some element of control over that.
The Greeks did develop musical notation, in fact, two separate notations, one for voice and one for instruments. And that we know about in some detail from ancient sources. And from the 17th century on, really, examples of notated music started to turn up.
People always build on history, and they were going back to old thinkers again and again and again. Nothing happens in a void. There is certainly a need or a wish to standardize more and more. That comes in again and again as sort of a church often wanted to exert some level of control. So over time, we see that development where there is money put into this, and that also drives technological development. And books are expensive to write and expensive to keep and expensive to make.
We are still a long way off music being freely printed and distributed to the general public. Notation is still seen as a tremendous privilege, but other leaders outside of the church start to follow suit as a standardized system starts to become more prevalent through the 14th century and beyond. It may take quite a while to lead to a wider democratisation of notated and printed music, but it doesn't take long at all to arrive at the very first IP dispute, a good 500 years before Ed Sheeran had his day in court.
If we think of sort of a broadening scope of written music or of printed music, we're looking at the 14th, 15th century. And from 1500 onwards, you get printed music, which plays a big part in this. I wouldn't quite call it democratization of music, but a spread beyond the establishment to some extent. And yes, you get reaction against that. So the reaction against making things slightly more accessible, we're still talking within a certain kind of group of people, but like leaving the court, there is reactions against that. There's a fairly famous case of Albrecht V of Bavaria. Famously had a very good court chapel. We're talking sort of 16th century Germany, Munich. Fairly famous court chapel. Orlando di Lasso was his court chapel master. He's asked him to compose these beautiful penitential psalms. He has them written out in gorgeous codices, like beautiful big books with beautiful illustrations, just exquisite. And he forbids Lasso to publish them. So at this point, you would actually expect an author to think about, can I publish this music and spread it more widely? But Duke Albrecht wants them for himself. And he wants this to stay something exclusive. Because of course, as printing comes in, and then with printing alongside, you still have a manuscript culture, but also there is more manuscripts being written then by what we might call amateur musicians or for the private use away from the courts. And at this point, you get rulers reacting and saying, actually, no, this music is for me, for my eyes, maybe for my guests to show them off at the dinner party, but not for the general public. And with that sort of slight spread in democratization, you actually get the first idea of intellectual property around music. Like, who does this music belong to? Is it the ruler who has asked his court master and has paid him to compose it? Is it the composers? At this point, you would expect a composer to be able to disseminate his music without necessarily the approval of the ruler. Or is it the printers? Because printers are starting to ask for printing privileges, that no one else can print the music they've printed because they've invested the money into this. So quite often you see in the 16th century, you start seeing in the front of a printed book a privilege given by a ruler to a certain printer that he's the only person who's allowed to print this music. So it's an interesting case of starting to want to control access to music or the commodity of music as well, because now if you start printing, if you start selling it, someone needs to pay for it, and who gets the money?
So basically, the idea of a tailor's version originated in the 1500s.
I mean, if we're talking sort of 16th century is the time we're talking, where I would argue that music is starting to spread to more people. More people have access to written music. We still always had access to oral transmission. But if we're thinking of polyphonic music, written music, madrigals, chansons, that kind of thing, yes, the 16th century, you start seeing more people having access to that. And there's a kind of famous phrase of the rise of the amateur musician. So you no longer have to be associated with a court. You no longer have to be a trained church musician to be able to have this music. And this idea that you can actually sit around your dinner table and invite your friends and you sing from some part books together, and all sorts of polyphonic music being performed in the home. Now, lots of caveats to this. Of course, we're still talking about a limited area of society that is limited by where you live. So cities much more privileged than rural areas in terms of access to written or printed books. Gender is still a huge factor in this. This will change over time, and that's quite an interesting question to look at, when women have access to what type of music books, but they have to be even more privileged often to be in that position. It has to do sometimes with political or religious suppression that you live in. So access to music and to education that would lead you to be able to read text and music is still, of course, restricted.
The way we teach music today has changed from the 16th century, sure. But there's an argument to be made that music education is still something that is somewhat ring-fenced, which makes you wonder how much great music we're missing out on still in 2026 because of the system for students.
In some societies, everybody's a musician. This happens in quite a lot of African countries, and children are encultured into musical activities from the time they're born. And there's no such thing as an unmusical person. Some people obviously are more musical than others, but everybody's musical, and music making is something which takes place in the community. And a lot of that is done by imitation. So the teacher will sing or play a phrase, the student will play it back, and they'll do it again and again and again and again, which is, again, very different to the classical Western tradition, which usually is based on readings and notation. And we found this when I took these learning practices into schools. One of the most notable things that happened was that a lot of the kids who had previously, and this happened in every class that we've looked at across 21 different secondary schools in the research, in every single class or school, there would be one or more kids who the teachers said had no musical ability and no interest in music, and they themselves declared the same thing, and these kids were often being sent out of music. When we allowed them to choose their own music, choose their own friends to work with, and teach themselves how to play the music in groups by ear, these were the very kids who rose up and became leaders of the group, and in many cases really showed themselves to have a huge amount of musical ability. So that type of musical ability was there, but it was not being tapped into by the notation curriculum.
The most interesting ways in which we teach or we learn is when we allow ourselves to understand through different methods. I mean, I'm patron of an organisation called Artists, which actually which encourages young children 4 or 5 years old or slightly older to learn through play and through creative thinking, and that's the way in which they'll pick up ideas that might help them to understand scientific or mathematical ideas as well. And I love that way of thinking. I mean, for example, when I was young, mathematics was taught in a way that we just recited times tables, and I didn't think that was learning maths. Even then I loved playing with numbers, and I found it interesting the same way as when I was young. If I was playing through reading music, I'd still want to start playing around with the notes and see where I went, and that's how I got into jazz and other ways of playing as well. So I think there's a lot to be said, when you're a child, about really allowing children, allowing yourself to play and explore ideas, and not being given rigid thinking, which I think can then imprison you for the rest of your life in how you think.
Of course, every student is very unique. They have different learning methods, so you tailor the lesson depending on what they need and also what they're looking for, because not everyone wants to do exams. Not everyone actually wants to learn to read and play. Some people just simply want to play to enjoy the music. So I would tailor that depending on what their needs are. If you take a young child, for example, the family want them to do exams, I would definitely start them off the traditional way of reading, integrating note reading to playing with a correct finger technique, shape, understanding of rhythm, all of that into one. Then there are sometimes students that do pick it up easier by listening rather than reading, or perhaps play something, have them copy it, and then slightly different, because with that kind of method often they pick up the music in a different way, that they're feeling it more, it comes more naturally, but in doing so they're slightly missing out on the memorization of notes.
And what I'm saying is, and I've never said we should replace what we've already got, the amazing music education we've already got should never be replaced, but it's ignoring the whole history of how music even came to be in the first place. And when we do that, we ignore huge numbers of children whose learning styles are aural and non-written. We are all musicians inside of us, and in our highly complex split society with massively stratified divisions of labour, only a few people get to become musicians professionally or music teachers professionally. But it should be the case for our basic humanity, in my opinion, that everybody can play and sing, and that everybody has the opportunity to do that. And you only have to look at some of the amazing choirs that are available now for children and for grown-ups to see how much difference it can make to somebody's life to be involved in making music with other people. And there is research actually by one of my colleagues, Sue Hallam, which strongly suggests that people who sing in choirs in later life report greater sense of well-being than people who maybe do other more static hobbies. Being musical is part of our humanity, and I think it's quite wrong for governments to, for example, say they're going to take it out of the curriculum and things like that. I think that's immoral.
Next episode, we're going to take a look at some of the types of organised music that begins to emerge as a result of the rise of notation, the new sort of instruments we begin to construct, and how Thomas Edison used some tinfoil to change the course of music history forever.
cross, you said, I am as constant as a northern star. And I said, constantly in the darkness, where's that eye? If you want me, I'll be at the bar. On the back of a cartoon coaster, in the blue TV screen light, I drew a map of Canada, oh Canada, with your face sketched on it twice. You're in my blood, you're like holy wine. You taste so bitter and so sweet. I could drink a case of you, darling, and I would still be on my feet. I'd still be on my box of pains. I'm frightened by the devil, and I'm drawn to those ones that ain't afraid. I remember the time you told me life was touching souls, and surely you touched mine, 'cause part of you pours out of me in these lines from time to time. You're in my blood, you're like holy wine. You taste so bitter and so sweet. I could drink a case of you. Ooh, darling, I'd still be on my feet. I'd still be on my like yours. She knew your life, she knew your devils and your deeds, and she said, go to him, be with them if you can, but be prepared to believe.